Hey, good morning, Redemption Church. I want to give a shout out to all of our campuses this morning. I want to start with the Eastside campus over here against the foothills of the Cascade. Love Eastside. Down here in the middle, we have the Central campus. Once you're in there, you never come out. And then Westside is right over here. Loving the Westside campus, digging you guys down there. Now, obviously, we are not multiple campuses. This is not a video venue. We are one single church under one single roof, but I am not with you this morning. In fact, as you are watching this, I am on an airplane with my family. We're headed to Southern California, chasing the heat, gonna have a good time with my wife and kids, but I didn't want to miss out on Advent as a church. And so this, as I shared last week, is a real important time of year for me. I love the tradition of Advent. I love how it brings family together. I love how it focuses on the big story of Jesus. And so I'm coming to you via video so that I can continue in the series we're in, tracking the birth of Jesus through the Old Testament and into the New. And so what I want to do right now as we get underway is I'm going to go ahead and pray. The historic me is going to pray for the current you, and we're going to see Jesus bring all of that together and really from that hopefully have a great morning this morning. So let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, I thank you again for the love you show us. I thank you for the traditions of Advent. I thank you for traditions. One of the things I find so often is that we struggle as modern Christians to really celebrate traditional things. We almost see tradition as somehow counterintuitive to growing spiritually, and yet I find that when we really see the meaning behind these things, it only makes our spiritual life richer, and we see you more clearly and in diverse ways. And so I pray as we continue in the series, as we continue in the season of Advent, that we will be more riveted by you, more captivated by your message to us, and that from that we will love you all the more. And so pray for this morning, pray for us. Thank you again for the grace you give us in your good and awesome name. Amen. So the Bible, and I try to say this to you guys every chance I get, the Bible is not a series of disjointed stories. In fact, all of human history, we shouldn't really look at it like seven dispensations or the three ages of man. We shouldn't even see this as two testaments. If anything, the Bible is one cohesive story, right? It's God's redemptive plan unfolding through the ages, one singular agenda leading up to Christ, through Christ, and beyond to the glory of Christ. All of that is in the Bible. And when we study Advent or celebrate Advent, what we're doing in that, in a lot of ways, is reflecting on that unfolding story of redemption, right? So that's what it's been all about. So the first week of Advent, we looked at the word hope. But we were looking at how hope unfolds from Genesis all the way through to the birth of Christ and beyond. And we were seeing that thread of hope even in the context of despair. Then last week we looked at joy, and we were looking at how joy was forged in Eden. Joy was lost in the context of Eden, and then there was despair. And yet, even in the midst of despair, we can still find joy. And that joy is then rooted in the person of God, just as hope is rooted in the person of God. Hope and joy are connected to God's presence. Well, in the same way this morning, we are looking at the third Sunday of Advent, the third word, which is the word peace. And particular, we're looking at peace in the context of conflict, right? That's the whole heart behind this particular morning. Now, what we know as people is that peace is popular, right? It's popular in the sense that it has its own symbol, it has a following. If you hashtag peace, it's gonna trend, right? We love the concept of peace. We want peace to be a reality in our world. But here's what I find more and more. We talk a lot about peace. We hunger for peace. We preach peace. We encourage peace. But frankly, we find peace to be elusive, right? And part of this is because we take this word that has a particular definition about harmony and unity, and as the Old Testament would call it, shalom. But then we contort the word, we twist it, we try to fit it into our experiences. In fact, if anything, we'll use this word peace, or we'll try to secure peace in very non-peaceful ways. So as a kid of the Cold War, for example, I would hear often that the way that we're going to maintain the peace is through strength. So much so that we decided, we're going to create these large weapons with nuclear warheads, and we're going to call those peacekeepers, right? The only way to keep the peace is through this threat or fear of force. Or the Colt 45, the peacemaker that settled the West, right? We settled the West at the end of a weapon. We even have an oxymoron, which is fighting for peace. We best our enemies and then force them to sign what? Peace treaties, right? I mean, the list goes on and on and on, where when we think about the ideas of peace, more often than not, what we're talking about is the threat of hostility. We're not really talking about harmony, but we're talking about the threat of harm as the method or motivation for people to then be peaceful. Right? This is how we twist it. This is why peace is elusive. This is why even as we celebrate this third Sunday of Advent, and that is peace, that we almost have to uncouple ourselves a little bit and say, well, what kind of peace are we talking about? Because so often we've lost the definition. The other part of this that I find to be remarkably true is that if we're just candid with ourselves, peace, we don't find it as exciting, right? We don't find ourselves enamored by peace or enthralled with peace like we do conflict, right? Across the board. Just think about entertainment for just a minute, right? You think about things like cable channels, right? You and I probably have hundreds of cable channels if you actually are on a dish or have cable or whatever else. What you're never going to find is the Peace Channel. You're not going to find the Harmony Network, right? Because we're not interested in that. We want other things. You think about video games like the Xbox One. What you're not going to see real popular in the titles of the Xbox One are games about peace or creating peace or maintaining peace. We want violent games. We want aggressive games. We want conquering games. That's what we desire. We don't want peaceful sports. We want combative sports. I mean, how many peaceful sports are there, right? Curling. Nobody watches curling. Why? It's too peaceful. We don't want peaceful sports. Movies the same way. There are peaceful movies that are made and they win tons of awards, but they're never blockbusters, right? They don't rake in the cash for the same reason. We want aggression. We want to see the thug get punched. We want to see the mean girl get her own. We want to see the villain die or burn or fall or just be removed of power in an aggressive way. So when we talk about peace, when we crave peace, when we preach peace, when we encourage others to peace, we have to stop and be honest and say, but when it's settled at the end of the day, we pull toward conflict. It's just in our DNA. It is in the cards for us that we prefer aggression over kind of peaceful pursuit and peaceful living. And the reason for that starts back in the book of Genesis. And so looking at Genesis chapter 1, we see a particular scene, and it's not a scene of conflict. It is a scene of legitimate peace, right? When God created with the intent of unity, the intent of harmony, this idea again of shalom in the Old Testament. And so God creates in the beginning in the spirit of seeing unity and peace. It starts in Genesis 1:27. It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them, and then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves on the earth. I mean, just that opening scene, there is this idea in which God is creating the man and the woman and the environment and the creatures of the environment to have this sense of harmony, right? Interconnectedness, interrelatedness is not one trying to best the other, but there's unity. Then you drop into Genesis chapter 2, and it says, and on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all of his work that had been done. So God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. This idea of God resting in the creation, resting with the creation, again, harmonizes this idea of peace, right? So he had peace among his people had peace with him. All of creation had this harmony. And then it goes further. And he talks then about the relationship between the man and woman, the husband and the wife. It says, therefore, the man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. And so everything is harmonious, right? Husband and wife that just love each other and don't fight and don't disagree and don't disregard one another and don't ride over the top of one another. No, they had peace and harmony. They had peace and harmony with God. It was all wound up in this one great sphere of shalom, right, of peace. It was all there. And again, it's rooted in the presence of God. It's not just simply that Adam and Eve weren't sinful or anything else. It's God's presence is there, and where God is present, there is peace. But then we ebb into chapter 3 of Genesis, and there we see the protagonist, we see the deception, we see the action of rebellion, and then from that, everybody begins to scramble. And in those moments, it goes from peace to total conflict, where everybody's looking out for everybody else is against everybody else. In fact, in Genesis chapter 3, it starts in verse 8, where God comes into the garden. Adam and Eve have already rebelled. They've already covered themselves up. They're hiding away is really what it comes down to. And the Lord calls out and says, "Where are you?" And Adam said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid." Right? Just pause on that for a minute. I heard you coming into the garden, and I was afraid. I want to quote one of the great philosophers and theologians of modern history, Yoda, who said that fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to hate, hate leads to anger, anger leads to suffering. The reality is that Adam, as soon as he was afraid, was absent of peace. And fear oftentimes is the catalyst for why there isn't peace in the world. One nation fears another nation, and that escalates into war. One person fears another person, and so they act in violence. One person fears poverty, and so they may steal from another that they perceive to have wealth. So fear is a driver to the absence of peace. And so as soon as Adam feels that spark of fear, right, that's when you know peace has exited Eden. It's exited Eden. So he is fearful. He's afraid. And he's afraid, it says, because he was naked and he hid himself. All the more, as soon as there's insecurity, as soon as you feel the need to hide something, you're not at peace. You have internal conflict. And that internal conflict is going to spill out into an external conflict with those around you. And so in verse 11 it says, and then God says, well, who said that you were naked? And then he says, you have eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat. And the man said, well, it wasn't me. It was the woman that you gave to be with me. She gave me the fruit and I ate it. So notice what Adam does now. He's not seeking unity. He's not seeking peace. He's not seeking to get along with those who are there. He's blaming everybody. He doesn't just blame the woman. He blames God. He says, God, it's your fault that you gave me her. So now it's Adam versus God and Adam versus woman. And what Adam's trying to do is say, and God, you should take it out on the woman. So now you have this triad of friction. Then it goes on, and the woman says, well, it wasn't me, it was the serpent who deceived me, and then I ate, right? So you see, it just starts to begin to cascade. So everybody's blaming everybody's pointing a finger, everybody's selfish, everybody's self-interested, nobody wants to be in trouble, they want the other person to take the blame, they want the other one to take the fall, and so now you have chaos, you have conflict. And as the story unfolds, what we see is that God says, here's the consequence. The consequence isn't just that you're all pointing the finger at one another. The consequence is that aggression and that brokenness and that absence of peace is going to escalate. So first of all, what God says to the serpent in verse 15 is he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, right? So I'm going to put conflict there. Right? You've invited the absence of peace, and so I'm going to actively put conflict. It's going to be between your offspring and her offspring is going to bruise your head, and you're going to bruise his heel. There's going to be war. There's going to be conflict. Then he says to the woman, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children. And then he says something more. It's bad enough that there's going to be pain in childbearing, so there's no peace in bringing life into the world. It's going to be pain and conflict. But then he says, your desire shall be for your husband, and yet he will rule over you. Now, when you read that, you might go, oh, how sweet. Her desire is going to be to cook for him and care for him and love on him and serve his needs. She desires him, but that's not what's meant in the original Hebrew language. What it's saying is you're going to desire to control your husband now, and yet he's going to rule over you. You're going to have marital conflict. You're going to have the absence of getting along. You're going to have differences of opinion that create hostility and friction. Conflict, no peace in marriage, no peace in society, no peace with God. All of these things begin to flow out. No peace in bringing life into the world. And then he says to Adam, Because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you that you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground because of you, and in pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. And so now you have creation's going to have conflict. Adam's going to be doing this in pain. He's not going to get along with his wife, and none of them are going to get along with God, right? So hostility, hurt, suffering, no peace. By the end of Genesis chapter 3, it says that God drove or banished the man out of the Garden of Eden, and he put an angel there with a flaming sword, which says, you know what? You can't cross this boundary. That is another marker of hostility, right? So you just watch in a single chapter, it goes from perfect shalom and perfect peace to the kernel, the seed of all conflict that we experience in our world, whether it's internal conflict, marital conflict, social conflict, doesn't matter. It all hails out of Genesis chapter 3. And as you continue to track through Genesis, you see that continue to grow. So you get to Genesis 4, and who do you run into? Cain and Abel. And what happens? Cain is jealous and envious of his brother, and so he kills his brother. No peace. Then you get to Lamech, and Lamech is attacked by a stranger, and so he kills this stranger. So greater conflict. Then you get to Genesis 6, and there's wickedness in the heart of man perpetually. There's violence. There is absolute disunity. It's just chaos. And so God says, enough is enough. I'm going to finally judge. I'm going to purge. I'm going to start over with the project, right? Which again is the absence of peace. Judgment is the ultimate conflict. It's divine judgment for hostility. And so God floods the earth, minus Noah and his family, who are kept in this ark, and eventually the ark comes to rest, and Noah comes out of the ark, and one of the first things Noah does is in Genesis chapter 8. It says in Genesis chapter 8, starting in verse 20, that Noah built an ark to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and he offered a burnt offering on the altar. So he says, God, I'm going to worship you. You spared my family through the flood. We were not killed under your judgment, and so I'm going to worship you. And so he begins to worship God. And the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intentions of man's heart are evil, even from youth. He says, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done, whether the earth remains in seed time or in harvest, cold and heat, summer or winter. I'm just not going to do it. I'm never going to judge in this way again, right? So God says, you know what? You have worshiped me after all of this, and I'm not going to bring a catastrophic judgment to the world. And then now listen to what he says next. This sounds so much like Genesis chapter 1. It says, and God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Now, we might hear that right there and go, wait, this is great. It means by Genesis chapter 8 and chapter 9, God is seeing kind of Eden reborn again, right? So it's going to be this scene where out of the cursed earth springs new peace, right? And it's going to be like what Eden was supposed to be, and God's going to reestablish harmony, right? That's what you would think from this, because it sounds just like the conditions of Genesis 1. But then it says this. It says, God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. And immediately in verse 2 it says, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, right? And upon every bird of the heavens, upon every creeping thing that is on the ground, and every fish in the sea. Into your hands they are delivered, right? Now there's a couple of things that are important. One is, there's not going to be harmony within creation and with people. He says, you know what? I want you to be fruitful and multiply. I'm blessing you, but creation's going to be afraid of you. The beasts of the field are going to be afraid of you. And I deliver them into your hands, which means I give you the authority to conquer. Right? That idea of delivering something or someone into their hands is common in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So the whole spirit of it is saying there's still going to be pain. There's still going to be conflict. There's still going to be disharmony in this post-flood creation. And that's exactly what you see as you traverse the rest of the Old Testament. You see that same spirit where there is no perfect peace, but rather there is this proclivity toward violence. And part of this is real simple. It's easier in our fallen nature, it's easier inside the conditions that exist to be troublemakers more than peacemakers. Right? Like peacemaking takes real effort. It takes real focus. It takes this suppression of our own tendency or temptation toward getting our own or standing our ground or fighting for our rights or whatever else. So we're better at being troublemakers than peacemakers because peacemaking is hard. Troublemaking, pretty much you just let it fly and trouble happens. Right? And we all recognize this at all sorts of levels, like national levels and international levels, and how, one party can become angry and therefore another party's angry, and then people are invading countries, and we go, that's just a lot of hot-headed leadership that's prevailing. But if we're honest with ourselves, we know that part of the reason peace is hard is because we can't achieve it even in the most intimate relationships of our own lives, right? So you think about your marriage, right? And you may have an amazing marriage, but you still know that it's difficult. If you're going to have an amazing marriage, you have to work at that marriage. You have to work at peace. You have to go, I'm going to go the extra mile to love my spouse, and I'm going to go the extra mile to forgive them when they wrong me. I'm not going to camp on every offense. I'm going to go for the big picture of investment. Even in those conditions, you find peace to be hard. And there's times we have arguments or disagreements or somebody's feelings get hurt. And that's in marriage. That's the person that is one flesh with you. Or another one that's real close to this is just the parent-child relationship. How difficult it is to have peace in that relationship, especially if you have teenagers, right? Where they're starting to exhibit their own independence. They're doing their thing, you're doing your thing, you want them to do your thing, they want to do their thing, and it's hard to have peace. Many of us find it's hard to have peace in our own soul. Right? Where we feel anxiety or frustration or fatigue or just, we're always kind of on edge or we're always waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And so to have a sense of internal peace is very elusive, much less peace in communities or peace within our own nation. I mean, we look at just right now being in this presidential cycle and you hear what one side says about the other side and sometimes what one side says within itself about others, right? Peace. We're not good at it. We're just not good at it. If we're just being transparent and looking in the mirror and quizzing ourselves, we'd say, you know what? It just doesn't come easy. As a race, it doesn't come easy. And as I was saying, as you journey through the Old Testament, you see that on steroids. Right? You just see that people don't get along with people. People are easily agitated. I was just reading through the book of Judges this week, and Judges is a microcosm of the problem, right? So one person does something and the other side retaliates with greater force, and so then the other side seeks to escalate that retaliation, and it just turns into madness. Why? Because it's not in our nature to be peaceful. It's not easy for us to be peaceful. There may be a season of peace, and then there's a season of conflict. There may be a season of getting along, and then there's a season of just absolute disgruntledness, And as you track the Old Testament, you just see that pattern time and again, time and again, time and again. And so what you begin to see emerge through that threading through concept of conflict of the Old Testament, what you begin to see is a hunger, not just for peace, but a hunger for the one who could accomplish what the people could not do on their own. They were getting to the point of saying, we're not good at this. We can't maintain it. We can't force it. We can't create it. Once it's there, we lose it again. We need somebody, somewhere to step in to rescue us from ourselves. We need the one who will change everything. And in the book of Isaiah, you see Isaiah begin to give the promise of the coming one who would bring that particular type of peace. Now in Isaiah chapter 9, starting in verse 2, it gives a sense of the conditions. Everybody's in darkness, right? They're in darkness internally, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, theologically. There's just a lot of darkness. And so they need somebody to bring the light. And it says, but the light is breaking forth. They've been in the darkness, light is coming. And you go, well, what is the light? Verse 6 of Isaiah chapter 9. The light comes in a child. For unto us a child is born. This is the promise. Unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, right? He will control what the government is really all about. And he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. On the throne of David, he will reign over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, and from this time and forevermore. And the zeal of the Lord of hosts guarantees this will happen. They wanted peace, and God says, I am sending the one. I am sending the child who will produce peace. He is the heir of peace. He is the giver of peace. He is the sustainer of peace. He is the promise of peace. He is the presence of peace. That's why he is the Prince of Peace. And so the Old Testament readers of Isaiah or listeners would be like, yes, bring us this peace. Especially in light of the fact that they were in a season of conflict and impending exile, and it was going to be anything but peaceful for them. And so like, oh Lord, please come to give us peace. Come among us in your peace. Rescue us from us. Enter the conflict and instill in us, infuse in us peace. Now, the question maybe with all of that is, well, how would that happen? How would it happen that God would begin to infuse the people with peace? If I flip forward a little bit more in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 54 in verse 13, it says, all your children shall be taught, listen to this, all your children shall be taught by the Lord, and great shall be the peace of your children. Right? So catch that. Isaiah says there is a child who is going to come and bring peace. And we'll go, well, great. How does he bring peace? Well, this child is going to be the Lord. He is going to be God. And God will teach you. And from that, you will experience peace. It'll be infused into your life. It'll be indigenous to your soul because of what he teaches to you. That's this promise in the Old Testament. And so now the Old Testament people are going, then let's get this on, man. Let's see this child of peace. Let's see this teaching from God to us that brings peace. How do we find that? Well, when we cross the artificial line of the Old Testament into the New Testament, we see the fulfillment of this child of peace. In Luke chapter 2, starts in verse 8. It says, in that same region, there were shepherds out in their field, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And we learned about the shepherds last week and how, again, these guys would not have had a lifestyle of peacefulness. They would have been rough, and they would have been seen in a little bit of a suspect way, and not everybody would appreciate the shepherds. And so they didn't necessarily know peace. But it says an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people. For unto you, born this day in the city of David, is a Savior who is Christ the Lord. And now you hear that, right? Because we sometimes hear this story so often we don't think about this for a second. But this powerful angel comes with a powerful announcement, talking about a powerful Lord who is coming. And I'm sure these shepherds are going, then where is this guy? And what white horse is he on? And he must be 7 feet tall, and he must be able to fight anybody with just one swipe. Takes out 10 men, right? They're probably thinking like a powerful, ruling, reigning, kingly Lord, right? That's what their vision's going to be about this coming Lord who is changing everything. And they said, this is what you're going to find. You're going to find a sign for him. You're going to find a baby. You're going to find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. Right? When you think about a king who brings peace, they're all going to be thinking like we do. Right? You have to maintain peace through force. You have to have people fearing for their lives and therefore obeying what you command, right? That's the way we use peace in our world. And these guys are going to be thinking the same thing. And now an angel says, you know what? Everything's going to change. There's one that's changing it all. You're going to find the Lord, but he's a little baby, and he's wrapped in clothes, and he's lying in a feeding trough in a little kind of ghetto makeshift hotel room that was a barn. But you think about that image, and there's nothing that looks weaker. There's nothing that looks more incapable of maintaining or creating peace than that scene. It's a peaceful scene. A little baby wrapped in clothes is a peaceful scene, but it does not look like that's how you can achieve peace in our world. That's exactly how it's going to play. And then it says in verse 13, and suddenly there was with the angels a multitude of heavenly hosts who were praising God, and they were saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those whom with God is pleased. This would be the methodology for peace. This would be the means by which God brings peace. The heir of heaven, the heir of peace, is this little child who's going to come, and he's not going to swing the sword, and he's not going to sit on this power throne, and he's not going to have troops that just go through a bloodbath of you're with us or against us. No, this is going to be a Lord of peace who's different, who says you want to gain, you give up. You want to win, then you win them over. You don't beat them. If you really want to see transformation, you don't try to be king, you choose to be servant. More than that, it is the King of heaven who comes to be a slave and serve. That is how he's going to establish peace. Very different. But this is God's promise, right? This is what Advent's all about. We needed peace, and we needed peace in ways that are contrary to how we try to achieve it. We achieve it through force. God's going to achieve it through sacrifice. And so God comes in the person of Jesus to bring peace to us. And that's how he does it. He brings peace to us. He comes as a missionary with his message and means of peace. And that peace to us then brings peace for us. In Colossians chapter 1, we see Paul speaking about this. He says, "For in him," and that is Jesus, "all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." So this is why I say Jesus is God. All the fullness of God is pleased to dwell in Christ. "And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace," it says, "by the blood of his cross." Again, how does Jesus make peace? He doesn't shed other people's blood. He makes peace by shedding his own blood. This is so counterintuitive. This is so opposite of how we want to see peace established. God himself says they need peace. They can't create their peace. They can't maintain their peace. They are so upside down when it comes to peace. The only way I can see peace established in their world is I shed blood, not their blood, but my blood for them. That's peace. That's a peace unlike any kind of peace we understand in this world. And it was necessary. Look at verse 21. It was necessary for him to shed blood to make peace because we were once alienated and hostile in mind. Notice that. We were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds. Right? This is exactly why I say the whole history of man is conflict, war, rape, persecution, bias, bigotry. The list goes on and on and on. We're good at that because we were hostile in mind. We were good at evil deeds. We were alienated, not just between one another, but more importantly, we were alienated from God. And when we're alienated from God, we're alienated from the source of true peace. Genesis 1 and 2. Only God can establish peace. Only God can create rest. When we're alienated from God, we're alienated from our capacity for peace. And so we do tragic things. But Jesus entered the world. And in verse 22, it says, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh and by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. What Paul is just saying is, you know what, we were good at hostility, and Jesus came and suffered hostility to take out our propensity toward hostility and impart into us or infuse into us a greater enduring sense of peace. That's why it's the advent of peace. That's why we celebrate this. Now, if we go into John 14, we see Jesus was preaching about this before he actually shed his blood to achieve it. And what he promises in John chapter 14, verse 27, is he says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you, right? So he says, whatever you want to say peace is, if you want to call it a peace treaty when you're still pointing weapons at them, if you want to say that is your ally, even though you're still spying on them, he says, you can call that peace if you want, but that's the peace of the world, right? Even the Roman Empire in the first century, they maintained peace at the end of the sword. They said, the best way to have a polite society is that only the government has an armed society, right? And everybody else wasn't, and therefore you were kept in order, right? And that kept the peace. But Jesus says, I'm not offering a peace like that. I'm offering a peace that is different than the world. So deep, so true, so transforming that he says, let not your hearts be troubled, and neither let them be, here's that operative word, neither let them be afraid. Go back to Genesis chapter 3. What is Adam's first instinct? Fear. He's afraid. The absence of peace creates fear. Jesus now deposits a new peace and then tells us, don't be afraid. Right? I've given you what you need. Don't get locked into looking around at the conditions of the world. Don't pull a Peter where you get out of the boat and see the problems and stop looking at me and you sink. This is even Hebrews chapter 12. We look to the author and finisher of our faith, and when we're looking at him, when we're going to the God of peace, we're seeking the God of peace. We want the strength of the God of peace. What we experience then is that peace, unlike the world gives it. Just as much as we experience hope or joy, Advent is about the presence of God producing these values that we so desperately want and we so critically need. And so Jesus says, through the gospel, through my sacrifice, through my love, I give to you peace. Not like the peace of this world that's external or conditional or even temperamental. I give you a peace that's internal and transcendent, and man, it is consistent. He says, I give you a peace that the world cannot give, and I give you a peace that the world cannot take away. And that's the other bonus, the conditions, the strife, the problems of this world. Jesus says, I'm giving you something that those things should not sap you of this gift that I give. Now, I guess the question for us as believers is, well, then why don't we experience this peace like we're supposed to? I mean, if he's given us this peace, why does it seem like sometimes we're not there? Just like joy, just like hope, why do we seem to struggle with those types of things? And I think the answer is sort of simple. I go back to what I keep saying throughout this series, that peace or joy or hope are predicated on the presence of God. And if we're not pressing into the presence of God, we're not going to sense these byproducts that come with that presence. And so I think about Paul in Philippians chapter 4. Here he's bringing an encouragement to a church that's been very supportive of him. Paul's in prison. Paul has had people stab him in the back. Paul is having a rough time. And yet what does he say starting in verse 4 of chapter 4? He says, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Right? Here's a guy who really shouldn't have any reason to rejoice, but he's doing it and he's telling everybody else to do it as well. He goes on to say, let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. And then this is really the one for us this morning. He says, do not be anxious about anything. Anxiety is driven by fear. Fear comes from the absence of presence of God and those kinds of things. And so he says, you know what? Listen, don't be anxious about anything. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Now notice that really quick. He says, don't worry, don't be fearful, don't be anxious, but in everything, pray. And then notice what it says in verse 7. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. There's the promise. When we say, well, why don't I experience peace in my life? Paul says, well, here's the key, right? You have to stop worrying. You have to start praying. You have to thank God for what he's done. You press into him. And as you press into him, he promises to sustain you. He promises to give you peace in your emotions and in your thinking because you're getting closer to him. Because you're letting him absorb those anxieties, those concerns, those worries, those fears. And when you're in the presence of God, those things can melt away more and more. Again, I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's a promise. It's a promise that when we do this, he guards our heart, he guards our minds in Christ Jesus, right? With a peace that surpasses understanding, where you could even step back and be like, man, I don't get it because life is bad. Like I should be freaking out. But instead I have peace. Why do I have peace even when it's bad? Because God is present. So then how do we cultivate that peace? Well, Paul just continues. He says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's anything that is excellent or worthy of praise, think about these things. He says, saturate your mind with the things that God cares about. And he says, and what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things. So know what is true, practice what is true. And then here's the promise. And the God of peace will be with you. The more we saturate ourselves with the mind of God, the more we will find and sense the peace of God. Let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, I thank you for the fact that you are the source of peace. I mean, if there's anything that the data proves, it is the simple reality that for all of our efforts toward peace, peace in the Middle East, peace among superpowers, peace within homes, whatever it is clear we do not do peace well. We talk of it often. We celebrate it all the time. We do not maintain it or create it at all in our world. Only you can do that. And so I pray that it starts with us. I pray that as individuals, we will long for your peace, that we will pray for your peace, that we will press close to you, and from that we will become a reservoir that oozes the real spirit of peace within our world. And so work that out in us as we seek to press in closer to you. Jesus, we love you and thank you. I thank you that you are the Prince of Peace, that you are the giver of peace, and you give a peace that we will not find anywhere else. You are the exclusive holder of the true peace that we need. So we seek you and we seek that peace through you in your awesome name. Amen.